Well, good evening. We got a little bit of a short class. They probably because they heard that I was going to be teaching tonight. That's fine. But well, we'll see. Ben and Stacy are taking a little vacation, and so he asked me to cover his class tonight. He told me, he says, I want you to cover chapters 46 through 51. And I thought, wow, that's a lot of chapters. And then I got to looking at these chapters, and some of these chapters got like 60-something verses in them. And so I'm thinking, well, wow, that's a lot. But the more I got into it, the more I realized that that this is not going to be that difficult to achieve after all, given the subject. If you would just turn to Jeremiah chapter 46, and a couple of things that I want to bring out in the very beginning before we actually get into any of this. And I will say that chapters 46, 47, 48, and 49 will be spending like 5 minutes on those. And the reason is that those verses are containing judgments against nations. And they're all kind of set for doom and gloom. And so there's different ways of saying it, but they're all going to be saying pretty much the same thing, in that this nation is going to fall. This nation's going to fall. This nation's going to fall. So I don't know that there's a whole lot of point in us kind of going over that in much detail. But those chapters, 46, 47, 48, 49, are all pretty much about the same thing. I want to spend most of our time, the bulk of our time, in 50 and 51, because that talks about Babylon, who is the big player on the stage. And we want to say a lot of things about that. And then we're going to, at the end of it, we'll make some applications. The book of Jeremiah, up until this point, up until chapter 46, Jeremiah has focused his attention on the children of Israel and telling them, if you don't change your ways, bad things are going to happen. And that there is going to be consequences for their bad behavior. That happens all the way on up into it. Starting in chapter 46, there's kind of a switch that happens, and that is that Jeremiah starts to talk to the nations that are surrounding Israel. And so that's important to note. So he's going to kind of change the audience, change who it is that he's talking to. There's a reference in chapter 25, which we will look at here a little bit later, which kind of serves as an introduction to these prophecies. In other words, what God is saying is that although it's true that I am going to exact a judgment on the nation of Israel, I'm also going to exact a judgment on these nations that treated Israel badly. And we'll look at that verse here in just a minute. But there's two basically overarching things that I need you to keep in mind as we look at these chapters. Because everything that we talk about in these chapters, from 46 all the way to the end of 51, can be viewed through the lens of these two things. If you can keep these two things in mind, it will help you to kind of clarify what these chapters are about. And those two things is that, first of all, that God will bring judgment not only on His own people, but for the other nations for how they behave. That's the first thing you need to keep in mind. God is not determining that Jeremiah should talk just to Israel. He's talking to the other nations around there as well. And the second thing is that God, throughout these chapters, God is reminding them that He made them a promise. And that promise would find its birth all the way back into Genesis 12, and that is that through the Israel nation, that God was going to bring about the Messiah, and there was going to be a clean and clear and pure bloodline through which that was going to happen. So in other words, when the children of Israel were taken over into Babylonian captivity, and they had to stay there for 70 years or so, God is saying, even though you're among these people, and it would be an easy thing to think that those people could just kind of meld into their society, God said that's not going to happen. There's going to be a remnant that's going to come back that's going to be pure, and it is through that remnant that we're going to bring the Messiah. So those are the two things that you need to kind of think about when you think about all these things. So let's look at chapter 46, and like I said, we are not going to read all these verses. But I do want to bring out just a couple of key things in each one. And in chapter 46, we see that starting in verse 1, the word of the Lord which came to Jeremiah the prophet against the nations. And the first nation that we're talking about here is the nation of Israel. Now keep in mind that these things have not happened yet. These are prophecies, and Jeremiah is saying these are the things that are going to happen. And so very clearly he says down here in verse 5 and 6, he basically says what's going to happen to the nation of Egypt. He says, why have I seen them dismayed and turned back? Their mighty ones are beaten down. This is talking about Egypt. They have speedily fled and did not look back, for the fear was all around them. Do not let the swift flee away, nor the mighty man escape. They will stumble and fall towards the north by the river Euphrates. Talking about Egypt here. And so what Jeremiah is saying is that this is going to happen. The nation of Israel is going to receive a judgment from God, and it's not going to turn out good for them. We skip on down to chapter 47 here. Like I said, we're not going to spend a lot of time on all these. And then we have the judgment of Philistia. Philistia is over on the coast, just kind of north of Egypt there. I want to note verse 3 in here in chapter 47. Turn over to 47 in verse 3. At the noise of the stamping hooves and of the strong horses, at the rushing of his chariots, at the rumbling of his wheels, the fathers will not look back for their children lacking courage. Well, isn't that interesting? That really speaks to the degree of this destruction that the Philistia nation is going to endure. It's going to be so bad that even mom and dad are going to just run off and leave the kids. And so, when if your house was on fire and your kids were in there, you'd want to go in there and save the kids, right? At least I would, but anyway, it's one of these things where you can imagine the destruction is so complete and total that mom and dad are just hightailing it out of there. So that's going to be Philistia. So as you start to see here, the pronouncement of judgment on every one of these nations is pretty much the same. Look over at chapter 48. Talking about the judgment against Moab. Now, who was the father of the Moabite people? Lot. That's right. Lot. He occupied that plateau that was just to the east of the Dead Sea. That's where the Moabites inhabited. And the destruction there was going to be complete from an asset standpoint, but many of the citizens are encouraged to flee. But over in the latter part there of chapter 48, look at the last verse in the chapter 48 there. Keeping in mind that we could read all this, but basically take my word for it, the judgment is going to be fairly complete. But what's described in chapter 48 is the destruction of the real estate, the destruction of the assets. He's not necessarily saying that the people will be destroyed. As a matter of fact, he said you need to get out because judgment is coming. And then if you look at the last verse there, verse 47, he says, "Yet I will bring back the captives of Moab in the latter days, says the Lord." Thus far is the judgment of Moab. We don't know exactly when that happened. We don't know exactly how that happened, but evidently God is making a promise here that even though I'm destroying your city, I'm destroying your towns, I'm destroying all of the physical things, there is going to be a coming back of to Moab, and I'm going to bring these people back. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind, because although in most of these cases God is promising, look, I'm going to destroy the cities and everything, I'm going to give you opportune time to get out, and then I'm going to kind of give you an opportunity to kind of restore yourself. That stands in stark contrast to what he's going to promise Babylon. He doesn't promise Babylon that. And that's a very, very important thing for us to keep in mind. Let's look at chapter 49 here, starting there in verse 1, going down to about verse 6 is the nation of Ammon. Ammon was situated to the north of Moab and east of the Jordan River. They were also descendants of Lot. You can go on down to verse 7. Edom. Who was the father of Edom? Allyn? Esau. There you go, Esau. Esau was the father of Edom. They occupied that area between the Dead Sea and the Red Sea. Then you go down to verse 23, and we've got a judgment on Damascus, which is present-day Syria up there. Then there's these other little places, what's called Kedar and Hazar, which is basically the Arab nations, all the way down there towards Arabia. And then lastly, down there is the judgment of Elam. Elam was an area that was all the way on the other side, on the east part of Babylon. And it had really very little to do with Israel. But let's look at verse 36 there in that. There's a little interesting thing in there. He says, "Against Elam I will bring the four winds from the four quarters of the heavens." So you have to understand that when Jeremiah was writing this, he was using very, very poetic language when he was trying to get these points across. And when he talks about these four quarters of heaven scattered toward them and all those winds, indicates that the destruction of Elam was going to happen from all different directions. And so there was not going to be a whole lot of hope for them to escape. So that pretty much encapsulates what it is that we're talking about in chapters 46, 7, 8, and 9, is that God is promising judgment and vengeance on all of these other nations. And he says the same thing. So I would encourage you to there's some interesting things in there that you can read, that you can pick up on, but they're basically all saying the same thing. And then we move to chapter 50, which gets into the destruction of Babylon. And the destruction of Babylon takes chapters 50 as well as 51. And we're going to kind of look at various things in those, and then we're going to make some applications at the very end. So any other questions that you have about any of those nations? Not that I would have the answers to them. Anything that you want to say in regard to that before we get into chapter 50 and we really get into talking about Babylon here a little bit. Anything else? All right, let's look at chapter 50. Once again, Jeremiah says, "The word of the Lord spoke against Babylon and against the land of the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet." Skip down to verse 3. "For out of the north a nation comes up against her." Well, we can look back a little bit later on, and we can see that nation is the Medes. As a matter of fact, I told you earlier that we're going to look at another verse. Turn over to chapter 25. Jeremiah chapter 25, and we're going to look here, and we're going to see how in this chapter, these couple of verses here really kind of serve as an introduction to the destruction of all these nations, specifically Babylon. Way back here in chapter 25, starting in verse 11, Jeremiah says, "And this whole land," talking about Babylon there, "this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. Then it will come to pass, when 70 years are completed, that I will punish the king of Babylon, and that nation, the land of Chaldeans, for their iniquity, says the Lord, and I will make it a perpetual desolation." What's interesting to me is that in a lot of these nations that we're talking about here in these other chapters, what's interesting to me is that he allowed some of those nations to rebuild themselves. And so those people would move back in, and they would kind of rebuild their cities and re-inhabit them again. But when he says about Babylon, he says it's going to be a perpetual desolation. What do you know about Babylon today?
It's still not there.
It's not there. It's about 60 or 70 miles south of Baghdad, I think, in Iraq. And you can go and you can see the ruins, but once it was gone completely. And I think that's a great testament to the true nature of God's prophecies. When he said it's going to be gone, no one's going to inhabit it again, he goes on, he says it's going to be land for the jackals and the ostrich. In other words, it's just going to be taken over. It's going to be a ruin, and it's not coming back. And that's exactly what happened. Even to this day, I mean, you can go and you can visit, but there's nobody living there, and it's just one big piled heap. And so I think that's interesting. So if you see there in chapter 25, and pick up on that, and God is saying this is what's going to happen, and now then we move all the way forward here into chapter 50. Jeremiah says it's going to happen. I'm telling you, it's going to happen. Look at let's see here. Let's look at verse. Well, we started to read verse 3. For out of the north a nation comes up against her, that's going to be the Medes, which shall make her land desolate, and no one shall dwell therein. They shall move, they shall depart, both man and beast. In those days and in that time, says the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, and they and the children of Judah together, with continual weeping they will come and seek the Lord their God. All right? That's an interesting thing to kind of put in there, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But then what was the second thing that I told you that you needed to keep in mind? Is that God was going to fulfill his promise of bringing these people back. So even though the Medes were going to come in and completely destroy Babylon and a lot of the inhabitants of Babylon, God is giving these people plenty and ample time to get out of town. And so that's kind of what's happening here in verse 4. In those days, in that time, says the Lord. In other words, in those days, whenever this is going to happen, the children of Israel will come. In other words, they're going to learn their lesson a little bit. And both the children of Israel and the children of Judah, and they are going to come with continual weeping. In other words, we're sorry, we've learned our lesson, and they're going to seek the Lord. And they shall ask the way to Zion. In other words, how do we get home? Zion is the spiritual reference to what town? Jerusalem, right. And they're saying, we want to go back to Jerusalem. We want to go back home. With their faces toward it, saying, come, let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that will not be forgotten. So this is this covenant that he's talking about bringing the Messiah through this bloodline. It's also interesting here in verse 2, where he says, declare among the nations, proclaim and set it up a standard, proclaim, do not conceal it. So in other words, God is telling Jeremiah, look, I don't want this to be a big secret. I want you to go out there and shout this thing from the rooftops. This is going to happen. We need to get these people used to the fact that Babylon is going to be destroyed, and that they're going to have to get out. He says, Babylon is taken, Merodach is broken in pieces, her idols are humiliated, her images are broken in pieces. So you kind of get the idea of kind of total destruction here. In verses 4 all the way down through verses 10 is basically talking a lot about the children of Israel and the attitude that they're going to have about coming back. If you look at verse 6, my people have been lost sheep, their shepherds have led them astray. They have turned them away on the mountains, and they have gone from the mountain to the hill. They've forgotten their resting place. So these people have been listening to the wrong people, and that's kind of what led them away into idolatry and that kind of thing. But he's moving ahead here. And he's saying that they are going to have an opportunity to come back home. Verse 8 specifically, he says, move from the midst of Babylon, go out of the land of the Chaldeans, and be like the rams before the flocks. The rams were generally noted in sheep herding lingo, I guess, that they were always the ones that were kind of leading the way and everything. So he's saying you need to kind of be like the rams. We got to get out of Dodge here. We got to get out of town. So he says, move from the midst of Babylon. Look over at verse 11. He's talking here about the reason for this judgment. Why is it that Babylon is going to receive God's judgment? Well, verse 11 gives us a little insight into that. It says, because you were glad, because you rejoiced, you're destroyers of my heritage, because you have grown fat like a heifer threshing grain, and you bellow like bulls. What this is talking about here is their pride, that they thought, well, we've got everything that we need. We're fat and happy and sassy and all this, and we don't need anybody else. We're a rich city. We've got lots of people. We got lots of resources. And God said, I'm going to show you a lesson here. And this is one of the reasons that that you're going to be destroyed. Go down to verse 13. He explains that a little bit further. He says, "Because of the wrath of the Lord, she shall not be inhabited, but she shall be wholly desolate." Wholly desolate. You need to mark that. "Everyone who goes by Babylon shall be horrified and hiss at all her plagues." Everyone who goes by Babylon, after this thing is done, you're going to go by and you're just going to shake your head and say, "There's nothing here. This is complete and total destruction." Yes?
This prophecy is remarkable because it is so much out of the ordinary. As you mentioned, many of the nations in these prophecies that Jeremiah is making, God says, you're going to be punished, but you're coming back, and you'll rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
Often they would rebuild in the same locations because it was either strategic or it had good resources like water, soil for farming, other resources that they needed. So what we find in the Middle East is that city builds on top of city. And archaeologists can go back and dig through that. You already have the building material there. You've got the resources. It's an easy place to rebuild. Babylon was a huge city. Great amount of building material, even after the destruction. It was on 2 rivers. You think this would be a place that would be rebuilt for sure, and yet God said it won't be, and it hasn't been. That's remarkable.
Yeah, it is. It is. All right, skip down to verse 14. Here he's talking about the nations that he's going to use in order to exact this judgment on Babylon. So this is directed to the nations God will use. He says, verse 14, "Put yourselves in array against Babylon all around." He's talking about these other nations, the Medes and all that he's going to use to destroy them. He says, "All you who bend the bow," those will be the archers, "shoot at her, spare no arrows, for she has sinned against the Lord. Shout against her all around, she has given her hand, her foundations have fallen, her walls are thrown down. For it is the vengeance of the Lord, taking vengeance on her, as she has done, so do to her." God's saying the way that Babylon has treated these other nations, that's going to be the way that they're going to be treated. And I don't want you to hold anything back. He's talking to these other nations, the Medes and all that are going to be coming down and destroying Babylon. He says it needs to be complete and total destruction. Skip down to verse 17, and if you look down at that all the way down through verse 20, I believe, here's another reference to the restoration of Israel. He says, "Israel is like scattered sheep, the lions have driven him away. First the king of Assyria devoured him. Now at last," this is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, "has broken his bones." And then he goes on here and he talks about the fact that he's going to punish this king. Look down there in verse 18. "Behold, I will punish the king of Babylon and his land as I have punished the king of Assyria. And I will bring back Israel to his home." It says down there in verse 19. "Carmel and Bashan, his soul shall be satisfied on Mount Ephraim and Gilead." So there's God's promise. Even though I'm going to destroy Babylon totally and completely, there's going to be this remnant that's going to come out, and they're going to be able to go back home again. Verse 21 is basically God's attack orders to these nations. He's saying, you need to go do this. Go up against the land of Merathaim, against the inhabitants of Pekod. And these were areas that were inside the city walls of Babylon itself. Verse 25, I think, is interesting because it basically, sometimes we kind of get the idea that maybe nations are kind of doing this of their own will and all that. There may be a certain degree of that, but in this particular case, this is God orchestrating all of these events. And he says there in verse 25, "The Lord has opened his armory." In other words, pulling out all the stops, getting every resource that he has in order to bring it down on Babylon. "And he has brought out the weapons of his indignation. For this is the work of the Lord God of hosts in the land of the Chaldeans." Well, that's a pretty a pretty significant statement there. This is not just because Babylon happens to go up against a nation or an army that's more stronger than theirs. That's not the reason that this is happening. This is happening because God said, I'm doing it. I'm the one that's going to be basically orchestrating this whole thing. I want Babylon to fail, and when I want something to fail, it's going to fail. And I think that's important that we understand that God is the one that's masterminding this whole thing. Verse 29, if you skip down to verse 29, talks a little bit about the pride problem that Babylon had, and how what she has done to other nations is now going to be done to her. He says, call together the archers against Babylon, all you who bend the bow, and camp against it all around. Let none of them escape. Repay her according to her work, according to all she has done. Do to her, for she has been proud against the Lord. So what does that tell you about the attitude of a nation about being proud? Well, we don't need God. We don't need His help. You know, we're the United States of America, for crying out loud. Who's gonna mess with us? Okay, I can understand national pride. I get that. But when we can say that we've done this because of our own will and our own volition and our own resources, look at what I've done. Don't think that God is not in control here, and don't think that God won't exact retribution on any nation. And I'm talking about the United States of America as well. I don't know if that's going to happen. I remember I was telling Cherie a couple of days ago when I was preparing for this. I remember when I was in high school. In 1972, I was a sophomore in high school. I know, do the math, okay? But we were in history class, and we were talking about some of the old nations and everything that have risen and fallen, you know, the Romans and the Greek. And I remember my dad saying, you know, the average length of time that a world power has stayed at their peak was 200 years. And that was 1972. And he said, and this nation was established in 1776. And he looks at me square, he says, son, we got 4 more years. Scared me to death. I think, for crying out loud, the Russians or something are going to come over and take us over in 4 more years. Well, they didn't do that, but don't think it can't happen, because it can. It very well can. So this attack that all of this is orchestrated by God, and if Babylon had a pride problem, I can certainly see some of these same attributes in the United States of America. I don't know if any of you have heard much about this Respect to Marriage Act that's passed, and some of the comments that people have made about this, and just basically saying awful things about Christians, awful things about those of us that have faith, and it's just very, very disappointing to hear those kind of things. Allyn, you had something to say.
The pride of Babylon is more clearly demonstrated, I think, in Daniel 5, where Belshazzar is giving a feast.
Mm-hmm.
Outside the walls of Babylon are the Medes and the Persians besieging the city, and they're inside having a drunken feast because they are confident that their walls will protect them from anything that they can bring against them.
Yeah.
And they are drinking from the vessels that they took from the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So here's having a grand time. Look, we have conquered Israel and taken, destroyed their temple and their God, and we're having our drunken orgy or whatever it was with these vessels. And that night, the walls came down.
Yeah.
And they were destroyed.
Yeah.
That night.
And we need to make sure that our attitude about God and His workings in the nations is very, very clear. Let's go ahead and skip down to chapter 51, because we've only got about 5 minutes left here. A lot of this is repetitive. Verse 3 and 4 talks about the complete destruction of the Babylonian army itself. Verses 5 through 10 talks about the vindication of Israel, which is woven through these chapters as kind of a thread. Even though he's talking about all this destruction, he's constantly reminding these people that Israel is going to be spared, that there's going to be a remnant that's going to get to go back. Verse 11 is, how do we know that the Medes were the ones that were going to be the instrument of God's judgment? Verse 11, it says, make the arrows bright, gather the shields, the Lord has raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes. So there they are referenced in specificity there. Verse 13, I think is interesting. O you who dwell by many waters, abundant in treasure, your end is come. What struck me about this verse is they had, as Allyn said, they were strategically located off the Euphrates River. They had lots of population. They had lots of resources. And God says, you dwell by these waters. You've got abundant treasures, but that's not going to be enough. He said, your end is going to come, the measure of your covetousness. So it doesn't matter what you have. It doesn't matter what resources you have. I'm going to end this thing. So he goes on. I've got lots of other notes here that I could talk about here. But in the last few minutes that we have, I wanted to just make some applications here. Down there in verse 45, skip all the way down to verse 45. He says, "My people." Here Jeremiah is going to be talking about the people of Israel here. He says, "My people, go out of the midst of her." The her there is Babylon. "And let everyone deliver himself from the fierce anger of the Lord. And lest your heart faint, and you fear for the rumor that will be heard in the land, a rumor which will come 1 year after that, and another year a rumor will come, and violence in the land, a ruler against ruler. Behold, the days are coming, that I will bring judgment on the carved images of Babylon." There's a contrast here. If you look at this, there is the contrast here is between the power that God has and the power that these carved images have. And he brings these things down to nothing here. He says, "I will bring judgment on the carved images of Babylon. Her whole land shall be ashamed, and all her slain shall fall in her midst." So, compared to God's power, these gods of Babylon, these images, they just have nothing at all. There's basically four main points that I wanted you to kind of consider. And I realize that we covered a lot of things, and we only had about 35 minutes to do it. Four things that I want you to remember. First of all, Jehovah here is revealed as the ultimate God of both history and nations, regardless of the size, regardless of the time, regardless of the history. God is in control. You need to keep that in mind. And that's what we can learn from this. These were great nations on the world stage at that point. God controlled these things. That's number one. Number two, these great nations are just merely tools to perform God's purposes and hold them accountable for their actions. And make no mistake, if the United States will not turn things around, God will use some other nation, and it might not be a good Christian nation. He might bring an evil nation, just like he did Babylon. He's going to use that as a tool. So keep in mind that these nations, these armies, these invasions, these destructions, all of these things are just God's tools. The third thing, as small and as helpless as Judah may seem, God will fulfill his promise to bring back a remnant through which the Messiah will one day come. Even though there's going to be all kinds of destruction, all kinds of military action, God says this narrow sliver of people here are going to be coming back, and they're going to be the ones through which I'm going to bring Christ through. And that's critical that we understand that even though he's got the power to do all this, he somehow is going to save these people. And then fourth, the fall of Babylon was not just a matter of a stronger nation had finally arisen, but rather a matter of divine vengeance. So those four things, if you just kind of keep those things in mind, we just need to understand that this is more than just history, that this is something that we can apply to our times, and we need to do our part as citizens to let our light shine and do what we can do to make sure that the world knows that our God is the true God. Thank you very much.